We're coming to you with some breaking news. Russia has agreed to a ceasefire in Ukraine.
Huge development.
It is. As of 9:16 p.m. Eastern European Time, a full 30 days where the guns, at least in theory, are supposed to fall silent. This follows a proposal from the U.S. brokered in Jeddah. I mean, the immediate question, at least for me, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking the same thing, is how long can we realistically expect this peace to hold?
It is, I think, the first question that comes to mind when we see news like this, right? And to get at that, we're looking at some reports detailing the specifics of this agreement, but we're also drawing on some really fascinating historical analyses of past ceasefires in this region. This region has seen its share of conflict, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
What we want to try to do today is go a little deeper. We want to kind of move beyond those initial headlines, the ones that just give you the bare facts, and really try to extract some insights. What do these sources tell us about the real staying power of this ceasefire?
I'm with you. Let's jump right in. Let's break this down.
Yeah.
The first thing, at least for me, that jumps out from these reports is that this isn't some sort of limited or, a very narrow ceasefire. It's a comprehensive ceasefire. They're saying every single part of that front line, the entire thing, from end to end, is supposed to go quiet.
Yeah. That's not
It
insignificant.
feels like a pretty substantial commitment right out of the gate.
It does. And to your point, it's not just about the fighting stopping. There are some key elements baked into this agreement. Things like an exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilians who've been detained, and I think really importantly, the return of Ukrainian children who were, and there's no other way to put it, they were forcibly transferred to Russia.
Yeah, that's been a really disturbing element of this whole conflict.
Absolutely. So what you're seeing in this initial phase is a real focus on these tangible, humanitarian steps.
Right.
Which, that's a positive thing, but in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily equal or guarantee some sort of long-term political solution, right?
Right, right. And on that note, the U.S. is not wasting any time. They're
Yeah.
immediately reinstating intelligence sharing,
Yeah.
resuming security assistance to Ukraine. I
hmm
mean, that's a pretty powerful signal, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. No question about it. And I think it speaks to something that you and I have talked about before, which is, there's this coordinated element to what they're doing. It's not just about the U.S. stepping in to facilitate this truce, but it's also about them very publicly and, very clearly, reinforcing Ukraine's ability to defend itself, even as we have this pause in the fighting.
Yeah, it's a bit of a two-pronged approach.
Exactly.
Like,
And, you can bet that that's something that Russia is paying attention to and factoring into their calculations.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, there's another element to this that I found really interesting, and it's not one that we always hear about when we're talking about war and peace. Um, the sources are mentioning these ongoing discussions about Ukraine's critical mineral resources,
Mm.
big economic implications there.
Mhm.
Now, they haven't reached a final agreement on how that revenue will be split. That's still being negotiated. But just the fact that it's on the table, it introduces, I don't know, I think it kind of adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
You're right. It's not as simple as just, drawing lines on a map and figuring out who controls what territory.
Exactly.
It's about the economic stakes, the resources that are at play here. And what I think is particularly interesting is, we've got this immediate ceasefire, right? And then we've got these sort of humanitarian gestures and these security assurances coming from the U.S. And then layered on top of that, you have this question of, well, what about the future economic picture? What are the financial incentives that are going to be tied to this peace holding?
Right.
So you almost have this multi-layered approach. And I guess the question is, could that, in theory, contribute to this ceasefire being more resilient?
Interesting. It's almost like they're trying to build it on a foundation of a number of different factors, not just sort of one single agreement.
Right, right. Because any one of those things in isolation might not be enough to keep things stable, but maybe if you've got several factors all pushing in the same direction, it creates a slightly stronger foundation. We'll see.
We'll see.
Right.
Now, it's easy to get caught up in what the agreement says on paper, but let's not forget about Russia. They agreed to this ceasefire. And just for clarity, that happened around 9:16 p.m. Eastern European time. But, I've read President Putin's statement,
Yeah.
and I don't know, he doesn't exactly sound like he's, popping champagne corks.
He doesn't sound like a man who's expecting a lasting peace to break out any minute now.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He's expressing serious concerns, and, particularly this idea that Ukraine might use this time to rearm, to reorganize their forces. And he's also, raising questions about, well, how are we actually going to make sure that both sides are actually sticking to the agreement? How are we going to enforce this thing?
Hmm.
It's a healthy dose of skepticism, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it highlights, something that we've seen time and again in these types of conflicts, which is, you might have an agreement on paper, but if there's this deep-seated lack of trust between the parties,
Right.
that's a major hurdle to overcome. I mean, if you're constantly thinking that the other side is going to violate the agreement the minute you let your guard down, that's not a recipe for lasting peace, is
Yeah.
it?
Not at all. Not at all. But, it is fascinating, though, isn't it? Because
Hmm.
despite all of that, despite those reservations, they still
I
agree.
did.
So what do you make of that?
Well, the sources we're looking at point to a few possibilities, right?
Right.
And one of them is just this idea of pure, U.S. pressure. The U.S. has obviously been very heavily involved in trying to broker this. They have a lot of leverage, in terms of the aid that they're providing to Ukraine,
Right.
the sanctions that they've imposed on Russia. So you could make the argument that Russia felt like they didn't really have much choice but to go along with it.
Yeah. I mean, it's real politics. It's classic power politics.
Yeah.
The push and pull, but it also makes you think, maybe they see some potential upside for themselves as well, right? I mean,
Right.
we've heard talk about the possibility of sanctions being eased. That could be a huge incentive for Russia to, at the very least, give this a shot.
Oh, absolutely. And it's probably, it's a combination of factors, right?
Yeah.
It's rarely just one thing that drives these kinds of decisions. It's a whole calculus. You've got the pressure from the U.S., you've got the potential for some economic relief, and then you've got, Russia's own internal calculations about, what's best for them strategically at this point in time.
Right, right. And it's important to remember, as we try to make sense of all of this, this is not the first time that the international community has tried to find a peaceful solution to this conflict.
Yeah.
The Minsk agreements, those were signed back in 2014 and 2015, and those were really serious attempts to try to end the fighting.
Hmm.
What happened with those? I mean, I'm curious to get your take on that.
Well, I think the Minsk agreements are, they're really interesting, but they're also a little bit sobering, right? Because they serve as this really stark illustration of how fragile these kinds of agreements can be.
Right.
The first Minsk agreement, which was signed back in 2014, I mean, it basically fell apart almost immediately.
Wow.
Yeah, there were violations on both sides. The fighting continued, and it actually, it escalated into some pretty significant battles. I mean, the battle for Donetsk Airport, that was a really, really brutal fight that happened in violation of that first Minsk agreement.
Right.
So, that was a case where the agreement just didn't have any teeth. There was no real enforcement mechanism, and there wasn't really the political will on either side to make it work. Now, Minsk II, which came in 2015, that one did manage to kind of establish a more or less stable front line for a while, but it eventually devolved into what people started calling a frozen conflict.
I remember that term.
Yeah, which basically means that, the large-scale fighting might have stopped, but the underlying tensions are still there.
Right.
You've still got this simmering resentment. You've got these unresolved issues. And ultimately, that's kind of what set the stage for the full-scale invasion that we saw last year.
Right.
So the lesson from the Minsk agreements, at least in my view, is that you can sign all the pieces of paper you want, but if you don't have a robust way to make sure that both sides are actually upholding their end of the bargain,
Right.
and if you don't have the genuine political will to find a lasting solution, then those agreements are likely to collapse under pressure.
So it's not just about the words, it's about the follow-through, the commitment.
Exactly. And the Minsk agreements, sadly, were a case where that commitment was lacking.
Now, it wasn't all, doom and gloom, though, right? Our sources also highlight a more recent ceasefire. This one was in July of 2020. And I think this is important because it actually held for a pretty significant amount of time, something like between a year and a half and 2 years before things started to heat up again. I mean, that's got to give us at least a little bit of hope, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the 2020 ceasefire it's an important example to keep in mind because it shows us that, it is possible to achieve these extended periods of reduced violence. Like, it is possible for things to calm down, at least for a while.
Right.
And it does offer, I think, a glimmer of optimism. But at the same time, it's important to remember that even that ceasefire ultimately broke down. And it broke down, I think, because of these escalating tensions, because of the military buildup on both sides. And so it reinforces this idea that, you can have a pause, you can have a lull in the fighting. But if you don't actually address the underlying political issues, if you don't get to the root of the conflict, then those pauses are inherently precarious. They're not going to last. So, the 2020 ceasefire, I think it's both encouraging and cautionary at the same time.
Yeah, it's mixed bags for sure.
Yeah. I mean, if we're trying to draw lessons from history, I think what we see is that past ceasefires, some of them have lasted for a few weeks, some of them have lasted for several years, but ultimately, the ones that have really stuck, the ones that have actually led to lasting peace, have been the ones where the underlying political issues were addressed.
Got it. So bring it back to the current situation. We've got this initial 30-day period,
Mm.
and it seems like, at least for now, both sides are committed to upholding that. But the big question is, what happens after that? What are the signs? What are the signals that we should be looking for that might tell us, hey, this has a chance of actually lasting beyond those initial weeks?
Well, the sources we're looking at are pretty consistent on this point, which is that the critical factor, the thing that's really going to determine whether this ceasefire has legs, is whether it leads to serious, substantive negotiations on the core issues that are driving this conflict.
And what are those? Just to remind our listeners.
So we're talking about the contested territories.
Right.
We're talking about security guarantees for Ukraine. And then, of course, you have the always looming question of NATO membership, which has been a major point of contention between Russia and the West for many years. So if the ceasefire creates the space for those discussions to happen, for both sides to actually sit down at the negotiating table and start hammering out some kind of agreement on those fundamental issues,
Right.
then I think the possibility of this extending beyond 30 days, it goes up significantly.
So those are the things that we as, informed citizens, as people who are paying attention to this conflict, should really be watching for. If we start seeing those talks happening, those substantive talks, then maybe there's reason to be a little bit more hopeful.
Exactly. That's the key signal. Are they willing to engage in those tough conversations? Are they willing to compromise?
Right.
Because without that, it's hard to see how this goes anywhere.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think some of the signals that we're seeing right now are a bit contradictory. On the one hand, you have President Zelensky,
Yeah.
and he's talking about using this ceasefire as an opportunity to develop, some sort of framework for a comprehensive peace agreement.
Hmm.
And that sounds, at least on the surface, that sounds promising. But then you have other reports that suggest that, Russia's goal here might be much more limited. It might be about, solidifying their current territorial gains,
Mhm.
basically kind of freezing the conflict in place.
Right.
And those are two very, very different end goals.
They are. And that's that's a big concern. I mean, if one side is viewing this as a genuine opportunity to reach some kind of lasting political settlement,
Right.
while the other side is viewing it as just a chance to sort of catch their breath and, entrench themselves in the territory that they've already taken.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't bode well for the prospect of an extension, does it? It suggests that there's still a fundamental disconnect in terms of what the two sides are hoping to achieve here. And, to add another layer of complexity to this, the expert analysis that we've been looking at, some of these folks they're pretty skeptical.
Really?
Yeah, some of them are suggesting that President Putin, he might not be ready to agree to any kind of long-term peace deal without getting what he would consider to be some pretty significant concessions and, concessions from Ukraine, concessions from the West.
So it's almost like they're playing different games.
Yeah, it's almost like they're operating on different tracks, right?
Yeah.
And that makes it incredibly difficult to find common ground.
Yeah. Now, there's this recurring theme that keeps popping up, and it's this idea of make love, not war. And honestly, I'm a little bit torn on this one. On the one hand, I get it. It's a powerful sentiment. It speaks to this deep human longing for peace and understanding. But on the other hand, this is a brutal conflict. There's been so much death, so much destruction. And it feels, I don't know, it feels a little bit naive, maybe even a little bit disrespectful to just kind of throw out these slogans without acknowledging the very real pain and suffering that's going on. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I think, there's always a risk when we use these kind of, I don't know, almost cliche phrases,
Right.
that they can sound hollow, especially when they're juxtaposed with the horrors of war. And I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge, the very real suffering that people are experiencing both in Ukraine and in Russia as a result of this conflict.
Yeah.
We can't just gloss over that. But I do think that the make love not war sentiment, at its core, I think it speaks to something really important, which is this aspiration, this hope for a different kind of future.
Right.
And, when we look at the specifics of this ceasefire agreement, there are some elements in there that I think do reflect that, that desire for a more peaceful resolution.
Not jazz.
Well, I mean, the agreement to exchange prisoners, for example,
Right.
the commitment to return those children who were separated from their families. Those are not just logistical things. They represent a recognition, I think, of shared humanity.
I see what you mean.
Even in the midst of all of this hostility, there's this acknowledgement that, there's another side to this conflict. There are people who are suffering on all sides. And maybe, just maybe, if we can start to focus on those points of commonality, if we can start to rebuild those connections, then it creates a path, however small, however narrow, towards something better. Okay, I'm following you. It's not just about empty slogans. It's about concrete actions that demonstrate, that desire for a different kind of future.
Exactly. And, the cynic in me might say that those gestures are just window dressing, but I think it's important to hold on to the possibility that they represent something more genuine, something more hopeful.
Right. And, speaking of things that might be a little bit more hopeful, one of the things that jumped out at me from the sources is this detail about the CIA and Russia's SVR having these ongoing discussions. Now, that's not something that you hear about every day, I mean, that's not your typical diplomatic channel.
Yeah, that's some serious back channel diplomacy going on there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, right? Because it suggests that even while all of this stuff is playing out on the world stage,
Right.
even while the formal negotiations are happening, there are these other conversations happening behind the scenes. And the sources are saying that the focus of these talks is on reducing the risk of direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia.
Which, I mean, that's huge, right? Because if those two superpowers were to actually get into a shooting war, I mean, that's a scenario that nobody wants to contemplate.
Absolutely not.
So the fact that they're trying to find ways to de-escalate the situation, I think that's a really positive sign, even if it's not something that's making headlines.
And it makes you think, what are the longer-term implications of those kinds of talks?
Mhm.
If they can build some kind of rapport, some kind of trust, could that potentially lead to, a broader rebuilding of economic and diplomatic ties down the road?
I think it's certainly a possibility. I mean, right now, the relationship between the U.S. and Russia is, it's pretty toxic, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
But if these back channels can help to, smooth out some of the rough edges, if they can start to create a little bit of breathing room,
Right.
then, yeah, I think it opens up some interesting possibilities for the future.
So, as we try to sort of synthesize all of this information, as we try to figure out, okay, what does this all mean? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think we can say with some degree of certainty that we're likely to see at least 30 days of peace.
Mm-hmm.
Both sides seem committed to that at this point. But beyond that, things get really, really murky. It's hard to say with any kind of confidence what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's the honest truth. The initial 30 days, that's the guaranteed pause.
Right.
But after that, it's really going to come down to whether those fundamental issues that we've been talking about, the territorial disputes, the security guarantees, the NATO question, whether those can be addressed in a meaningful way at the negotiating table.
Right.
And, unfortunately, history is not on our side here. We've seen so many ceasefires in this region collapse, and we've seen so many disagreements that have just festered for years, for decades.
Yeah, and that makes it hard to be overly optimistic, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. And I think, if I were to kind of sum it up for our listeners, I would say that there's a glimmer of hope here, but it's a very fragile glimmer.
Right.
And it's going to require a tremendous amount of effort and good faith on all sides to turn that glimmer into something more substantial, something that can actually bring lasting peace to the region.
Yeah, I think that's well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question that I've been wrestling with myself as we've been going through all of this, and it's this. Could all of these seemingly disparate efforts, this fragile ceasefire, these back-channel talks, this talk of make love, not war, could all of this actually represent a real turning point in this conflict? Could this be the start of a genuine move towards de-escalation, towards a more peaceful future? Or are we just seeing another temporary pause in a much larger, much more protracted struggle? I don't have the answer to that question. I don't think anyone does. But I think it's a question that's worth asking, a question that's worth pondering. And I hope that our listeners will, take some time to consider it, to think about the various forces that are at play here, and to come to their own conclusions. It's a complex situation. There are no easy answers. And I think that engaging with that complexity, that's part of what it means to be an informed and engaged citizen in the world today.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for navigating all of this with me. It's been a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, deep dive.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the news and events that are shaping our world. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.